So, hi everyone. Welcome to our session today on Ionic, NgRx and Angular and building mobile and web applications with one code base. And my name's Duncan. I'm a software developer from Australia, and I've been really lucky to work for a consulting company for the last few years who have let me pretty much just do Angular. So I spent about half my time writing Angular applications. I usually work on some crazy amount of different teams, probably 12 to 15 different projects, all usually make it to production over the year. I do a lot of kickoffs or code reviews or serial committed to projects. But then the other half of my time, I get to do a lot of training and traveling around running workshops like here at NDC or doing Pluralsight and other things. But it's really nice just doing one thing all the time. So I do a lot of Angular. I get to talk to a lot of people. I get to see a lot of mistakes, make a lot of them myself, but also see what other people are doing in the industry and talk with people making Angular or doing projects or libraries for Angular. So hopefully I can share some of those conversations with you today. And if you're interested in this topic, I think you'll find it really close to home. So who here's been in this position? Hands up nice and high. You've just written a web application with a bunch of custom logic, and now you need to put it on a mobile phone and have it in the App Store. Who's been in this position? Who would like to take their web app and put it in the App Store? Yeah, most of us can kind of relate to this situation. And this is a situation that I've been in for a lot of last year. It's kind of the story of what I had last year, and specifically kind of talking about having an Angular application as your web application and an Ionic application for your mobile application. And I had a university in Melbourne, a Deakin University. They contracted me through the company I worked for to help with exactly this story. And then I also then had a school chain in Brisbane who had the exact same story. And then I had an investment company in Melbourne. So all of these companies, what we did is we made these NPM packages for them. And then now I've left where I used to work to write my own software or rewrite some software I have called Food Zone. So it's something I've had a bunch of runs at. And today I'm going to share with you what I was doing with NPM packages and more about what I am doing currently versus that. So we did a lot of this with NPM packages. We would have this separate web application or multiple web applications and a separate mobile applications, and then we were putting the shared code, the shared Angular code, into NPM packages. So these NPM packages were great. They're very robust. It's not that I'm saying you shouldn't do it. It's one of the options, but there's another option which I'll talk about. So I started to hear about people talk about mono repos in the Angular community. So this is Alex Eagle from the core team at Google on Angular, and he's like, oh, you'll love mono repos too. And then I see these popular podcasts in the Angular community like Angular Air and Adventures in Angular. And then I hear that Google and Facebook also use this mono repo approach, which is kind of crazy if you don't know that Google have just a single repository, and as a developer, if you commit code to master, then it's just going to get consumed by everybody who's using that instantly. So it's kind of a scary thought, but it can be done, and all these people are talking about it in the Angular community because they're all mostly Google people. So that kind of sparked me going, well, is there another way to do this? And then recently, NX came out, which is the narwhal extensions for the Angular CLI that allows you to make a mono repo. So I'm hearing all this stuff around it and learning about it and thinking, well, maybe I can use that for sharing code across mobile and web, which is what I've been doing more recently and one of the two options I'll share with you. So today we're going to be talking about what is the new Angular and Ionic, but we won't spend too much time on that. We'll talk about some of the options you have for code reuse. We'll talk about how NgRx, which is the way of doing redux with Angular, can help pull code out of your components to make them more reusable. And then we'll talk about your two different options. So you've got an option for using NPM packages, and you've got an option for using these NX Workspaces. So we'll be talking about these two different things. So AngularJS, the first version, we're not allowed to say Angular 1 anymore, or Angular 2. We're meant to forget about all this version stuff. But AngularJS was the first version, and it's been around for 7 years. It was one of the first kind of big frameworks out there, but it had problems. It was kind of slow. It wasn't so great when you scaled it. It wasn't the best option. But the new version of Angular is much faster, and they have a more lofty goal, and that is to be one framework mobile and desktop. And that's quite ambitious for a front-end framework, but this is their goal, and they're doing much better at it. They're much faster. It's a much better framework for putting on a mobile device. And you get lots of things for it. I'm not going to hark on too much about Angular today. I'm sure a lot of you already know a fair bit about Angular. The second version's been out for a while now. We're at version 5. There's lots of amazing things. You get the Angular CLI, which is a build tool for being able to start a new project, but also bundle it to send to production. You get awesome docs now. You get a big framework, so you get the router, you get animations, you get unit testing, all of it in one spot, one box. You don't have to go looking around for all these different libraries. You get a big community. You get universal for server-side rendering. You get patterns like NgRx. It's much more stable now. And it's much faster, which is great for mobile. So all of these reasons are kind of one of the reasons why it's still such a popular framework for the enterprise, because it's kind of one stop. And 2016, talking about mobile is an interesting time. It was kind of the first year we saw like the internet cross and more of the internet being consumed on a mobile device versus a web application or a desktop. So we're starting to see, and definitely in the company that I worked at as a consultant, much more demand for our web developers or our teams to be able to also deliver just as effectively mobile applications. And this is where Ionic can really help. Who here has used Ionic before? Okay, a couple of people. Who's heard of Ionic? Mostly everybody here. So Ionic basically is a way of taking Cordova, which HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for building mobile apps to put on the App Store, but you do it with your Angular skills. So it's fascinating watching someone who knows Angular be able to pretty much commit like within their first couple of days of a project on Ionic, even if they don't know it, because it's mostly Angular based, similar syntax, similar ways of doing things, and it's very fast to learn. But Ionic 1 was pretty slow. It had millions of installs. It was super popular, but just like the first version, it was kind of slow and people kind of ragged on it a bit for that. But the third version's much faster, and the fourth version's around the corner and will be faster again. So some of the things I really like about using it as an Angular developer is it's easy to get started like a normal Angular developer. You can just go Ionic start, there's a command line tool just like there is for Angular, and you go Ionic start new project and choose the type. You say I want tabs. CD into your project and you just go Ionic serve and you have it. So there's a lot of benefits to using Ionic for an Angular shop. It's kind of, we've found that we've been able to be quite effective at taking full stack web developers and doing Ionic with Angular versus say Xamarin, where we were successful, but the Xamarin guys really needed to be good Xamarin guys. We couldn't just take a web developer who was okay at C# and stick them on the Xamarin team and be, effective really quickly. So also you get this great ability to just go Ionic Cordova run Android -- release or something like that, and then boom, you have your IPK or your APK ready to go to the store. You've got to do more work from there, but it really is kind of along those lines simple. So it's been great for getting Angular developers to do mobile. But when you want to share code, then you've got to think about this. You get these awesome components like this. So you get these Ionic components that are like sliders, drop-downs, calendars, pickers, those sorts of things. And they're really great when you use Ionic. It's one of the fun things about using Ionic is you go, oh, wow, these are so robust. I wish I had like components from the web world that were so easy to use. You can even get them for Windows. And last time I gave this talk, I said, oh, but I've never met anyone who has an Ionic Windows app, and someone showed me. So I've met one. So there is some Windows apps still out there. But this makes it hard to share the code across both because the widgets are so awesome, they're so good for touch, that you don't want to not use them when you're making an Ionic app, but they're no good to take over the fence and put them in your web app because they're not designed to be in the browser. They're designed to be on a mobile device and they're not as performant. This is changing, but that's kind of the current state of affairs. So it's really hard to share those across, but now the Ionic team are betting everything on web components, and they have this library called Stencil for making web components. And when I say web components, I mean like Polymer style web components, like browser standard web components. So you're going to be able to take what you would run in your mobile device and also run it in your web app. So hopefully we can start sharing those components, but that's kind of just happening, but not here yet. So this is Angular and Ionic, and we want to share code between the two. What are our code reuse options? Well, we've got these different things. We've got components, routing, services, and state. And we have pretty much the same thing in our Ionic applications. And which things can we share across the two? So we can really share the Angular services easily. And if you're using NgRx, which I'll talk about, you can also share your state logic across these apps really easy. And it's great for that. But it's very hard to share these components because you end up using some library like Angular Material on the web, and then Ionic components or widgets on the mobile. and it's very hard to cross them back and forth. So it's very tricky to do the component bit. But if you have your own custom components, you make your own custom CSS styling and HTML, then totally easy to share across the two. Copy and paste sucks, we know that. It's not going to work very well. As soon as you have it in one application, you paste it into your other application, and then someone updates one of the applications, or one of the 4 applications, like a main menu, and then now you have to keep it up to date everywhere. So copy and paste doesn't really work very well. Putting it in a folder is equally as difficult. If you have like a Git submodule, you have a mobile app and a web app, or even just 2 Angular apps, and you share that with a folder that you copy and paste between the 2, it doesn't quite work so well because one, not necessarily versioned, not necessarily easy to get it into the ecosystem because it's outside of like the Angular project. And so just putting it in a folder doesn't work very well either. There's some things you can do besides copy and paste and sticking it in a folder and copying it into another project, is using NSwag for sharing code. So who uses Swagger on their API? Okay, who's used NSwag? Okay, interesting. So NSwag, I thought would be a terrible idea, but my friends who love to auto-generate code convinced me we should. But 5 projects we've used it on, and it's worked every time. It's been quite magical, even though I was a hater. So basically, you point it at your Swagger documentation, and it will auto-generate all of your Angular services, all of your DTOs, your view models from the server will get turned into Angular interfaces on the front end. You update your backend DTO or view model, and you just go npm run nswag, and it auto-generates all your interfaces and services again. So this is good. You can probably auto-generate like 20% of your Angular application and take it mobile and web. So it's pretty cool, but it doesn't do a lot of it. I want to get better. I want to get like 50, 70% code sharing across these 2, because often we're making not crazy complex mobile apps. It's often just line of business apps, and they share a lot of features between mobile and web. So this is where making NPM packages has been quite effective for us, especially if they need to be versioned between teams. One team needs to be on one version of the shared code and another on a different version because they can't update just yet. But it's not as simple as you think to do this. You need to follow the Angular package format, which is actually a real thing, comes out from the Angular team, and they say, if you want to build Angular projects for NPM, you need to follow these things. You want to have a metadata.json file so you can do ahead of time compilation, which in the Angular world means that you compile all your HTML templates offline in Node before you go to the browser to save doing that in the browser. It means much smaller difference between megabytes and kilobytes for your build size. You also need to have type definitions for your shared library that you're making in Angular, and you need to have d.ts files. You also want to make them a FESM or a flat ECMAScript module. I'm not making up that name, it is called a FESM. And basically it means having all your modules brought into just one module so it loads faster. And you might want a UMD file to run it in something like a plunker or something like that. And you might want to consider having Clojure compiler annotations for the future when maybe we use Clojure to crush our Angular apps smaller. I don't want to do any of this, yeah? I just want to write Angular code. So you're going to end up using a library to do this. You're not going to write it yourself. So it's even, when putting things in NPM packages is not as simple as you think. You're going to need to use someone else's tool to do it. But before we talk about that tool and the first option, which is using NPM packages, which is still really good and I've done a lot, I want to talk a bit about NgRx and how NgRx is great for sucking logic out of your components. Who's used NgRx here? Okay, a couple of, who's used Redux? Okay, same people kind of. Okay, so NgRx is basically the Redux pattern for Angular. That's what it is. It's the tool that you use as an Angular developer when you want to do Redux. And not Redux library, but the pattern. It's a little different in Angular because we use RxJS everywhere, reactive extensions for JavaScript. But that really helps, in terms of using all the power of RxJS like you would as an Angular developer across your state management as well. So basically the reason it's really good, not just for making good enterprise applications, because state management's probably the hardest part of making good Angular apps at scale. But in particular, in terms of sharing code, it just sucks all the logic out of your components and you can put it in your state management and your components get much simpler. And I'll show you why. So if you're doing best practice state management at the moment in Angular before you use NgRx, you're probably going to be following a pattern where you have container components and presentational components, or smart and dumb. And the container components, their job's really just to inject things like services or dependencies and be able to connect and get users or delete entities and things like that. They're the ones that have the smarts, but they don't really render anything. That's the job of the presentational components, which receive everything through an input or an output. A bunch of you have probably seen these. It's kind of a core thing to do. But when you do this pattern, then you get a lot of abilities to tell Angular not to check these presentational components and change detection, performance improvements, other things. But in state management, it gets trickier when you get them nested like this and you get 3 levels deep. And then all of a sudden you have another container component that needs the information down in this nested presentational component here. Then you've got to go out and out and out. And then most people go, well, I'll just make this one a container component and share state through a service. Best practice, works great. Make it an observable. Any component that injects service A and subscribes to this observable can then be updated. Great way of sharing state before you get to NgRx. But the problem is, as your app starts to grow out, you get more services and things, and then this service, points to here and here and here and here, you still end up in a mess. You still, as your application grows and grows, state's still difficult, still tricky to manage. And you end up with race conditions and other problems because anywhere can update anything all the time, both ways, and it becomes a bit of a bowl of mutable soup. So this is where having a single store can clean everything up and make things easier. So I'll do a quick talk about what it is. I might bore some of the people who have used it. But basically, a store is just a JavaScript object. And these words are all the kind of reduxy words, but it's the same in NgRx. So the store is just a JavaScript object. Here I've got a couple of slices of state. I've got companies and contacts. And it literally is a JavaScript object. I can select information from the store into my component. So here I could select companies. But if I wanted to delete a company, I don't delete it in the component. What I would normally do if I wasn't using NgRx, I would inject a service, call the Angular service, it would talk to my backend, delete the company, come back, tell me the ID of the company that was deleted, and then I would mutate my array of companies in the component and just update it right there. But that's not what you'd do in NgRx. You'd pull all that logic out of the component. The component now knows nothing. It just knows how to dispatch an action to ask someone to delete that company. So dispatch an action with a type and a payload. They're the 2 properties that are often on it, or you always have a type on an action and a payload here of an ID. And the people listening for that are 2 different places. You've got reducers and effects. So in this case, if it's a pure synchronous function, it will just go straight to the reducer. But a HTTP request is not a pure function. Pure function being a function that takes, given the same arguments, will always return the same thing. But a HTTP request is not a pure function. You might get a 400, you might get a 500, you don't know what you'll get back. So in this case, you listen for it in the effect. And the effect talks with your Angular service, it calls the backend, comes back. If it's successful, the effect will then dispatch a success action like this, saying delete company success. If it's an error, it will say, delete company error, and you'll handle it differently. But if it's successful, then you listen for this in the reducer. The reducer takes the previous state and the new state of companies with one less, and then it updates the store. But the thing about sharing code in this picture that's really useful, and anyone who now listens to this piece of state will be updated, is that you drag all that logic out of the component. You drag the service out of the picture of being injected in the component, and you just say, hey, just delete this company and dispatch an action. So things get much easier for sharing that NgRx state across these apps. All right. So the way I'd use it, I'd do something like this. I'd just inject the store into the constructor of a component, and then if I want to do something like login, I just dispatch an action with a type of login and the object that I've got with the username and password. So you can see how easy this component is because all the logic is somewhere else. All the injected service, you don't end up with 6 services injected in here. All right. So then if I want to select the state, then it's just as simple. I inject the store, and then I just go this.store.select, pass the selector. In this case, it's obfuscated a bit with get user here. And then I get the information from the store. So this is great for being able to take all your logic out of your components. You can go watch a longer version of me hark on about the beginnings of NgRx if you want. I've got a play-by-play on Pluralsight about it, but just a brief introduction today. So we use a lot of NgRx, been using it for over a year now. I was some of the first people to use it, and now it's kind of more mainstream. A lot of teams using it. But these NPM packages, what's that look like? I've got another play-by-play on that actually, because today's really kind of a story. I'm not going to dive in on how to set this up. I'm just going to show you the basics. So if you actually want to go step by step through any of these things, I actually have a couple of courses on it. So this is what I want to do. I want to make an NPM package, and I want to take the services and the state management out of it. So I use a generator because remember I told you it's a pain in the, like, you have to make it AOT compatible, you have to have type definitions, you want to think about closure. You use this library and it takes care of everything for you. This is the most popular one at the moment, and I've used it several times, it's quite good. So it's a Yeoman generator. If you've ever used Yeoman, it's like a application starter, and you can basically NPM install it on your machine. So you basically just go, hey, yo, it will say which project starter do you want to use. I want to use the Angular 2 starter. And then you give it some details, your name, your repo, the name of the project. Mine's really original, sample. And then which testing framework. It's quite robust. And then basically it makes you a project. And if you've done Angular before, these things are going to look really simple. The challenge is not so much understanding the Angular bits. The challenge is, the NPM package bit. So it gives you a source folder with a bunch of samples in it and this index.ts file. And in there you re-export all of the things that you want to be shared out of this NPM package. And usually you do that as an Angular module. So a lot of you will have seen Angular modules. They look like this. They're a decorator sitting on top of a class with some metadata in them. And here it's basically saying, I want to export from this module, from this NPM package, the sample component. And then down here for services in Angular, it's a bit different. I want to register this sample service in the consumer of this module. So this is my module in my NPM package. And when I consume it in an Angular application or an Ionic application, go register this service. So it looks very similar to what you're used to as an Angular developer. You're basically just making modules. And then when you want to consume it in the project that wants this code, you basically just npm install the package that you've made, and I'll talk about where from, and then basically you register it like any other Angular module, sample module.forRoot here in the consuming module. So this side of it's really easy. The tricky bit is the dev workflow and the configuring to get your package set up and where are you going to host it and all those sorts of things. So when you're in your dev machine, you use npm link. So you have that Angular 2 library you've generated with Yeoman, and inside of there you run a command that will build it for you, ready to send to npm. But when you're in your dev machine, you don't want to send it up to a repository and then pull it back down into your project. You want to be able to just go straight into your project and check that it's working. So you run an npm link inside of the library you want to share, and then you cd into the application where you want to use it, and then you run npm link and the name of the library you want to link to. And npm will manage that link for you, and then you can update both at once and they'll stay in sync without having to go npm install all the time. So that's pretty good, but it can be a bit flaky, and I've seen lots of teams struggle with it, and it takes you time to get used to it. And this is really the pain, this and where do you host it and everything that slows teams down with doing npm packages. Because most of the code that I'm sharing here is not some, build once logging tool and then just leave it alone. It's like stuff that you're constantly changing, like your auth module and your login page and your get users and show a list of my entities, this stuff that's always changing. And it's painful to always be building it over here and then building it again in your project and then checking it. It's nice when they're all in one place. But for libraries that don't change too much as I show you, then it can be quite good. So where do you npm? If you do this in the other project, and then you need to npm install it. So the Angular 2 library, Yeoman generator, easy to use. When you're finished, you go, generate it for me. There's even a command to send it to npm. But where do you npm install it from? Well, you could use a hosted package manager like npm. We've done that. That's nice. It's the easiest. You're going to be paying, less than $100 probably per month to get it up there for a bigger team, but then cheaper for smaller teams. But then you could use your own private repository like Verdaccio. I've seen several teams use that. They have their own hosted kind of repository on premise, and then they keep it all locked down. That works all right. And you can even install it just straight from a GitHub repo. So you can just use a URL straight to a repository and then npm install it from there. This one kind of sucks. Versioning's harder and all. It's just not, as robust as the others. So I've done this one several times, and I'll talk about in a second where I've gone from here, but why do I like it? The main thing I like this if you need it versioned. I worked with a government project and they were like, there is no way I'm going to share my dependencies across my teams and someone else's team. We're so separate, the teams are so big that if I have to have the same dependencies, if I have to always be on one version of this shared code, it's too hard. they are only going to update when they're ready. I can't just ship it out and we all get updated. So if you need versioned packages of your code, then this is definitely the way to go, NPM packages. If you have stable code that's not changing much, you've built it, maybe it was actually part of an Angular app and then you've abstracted it and it's never going to change for ages, then I also like this approach. It's simple, it's out of the way, it's shareable. If it needs to be public, this other approach I show you, it's one repository all shared in one code base. And if you want to have a tiny piece of that be public and something else be private, can't really do that. You know, the code that you make in one repo is private. So this would also be a vote where you might do an NPM package versus having it all in one repository. All right, needs more tests and it takes longer to configure. You definitely need more tests because you don't know the person consuming it, is it going to work? Not as well. If it's in the same project, built by the same build tools, then it's easier. More time to configure, definitely. I've seen several teams burn half a week to a week for one developer just to get everybody up to speed. So not that big a commitment, but still a bit of time. And AOT sucks, this whole ahead of time compilation thing. If you need to, you know, you're just going to have to run AOT. If you want a small Angular application, when you go to build it, you use the tools, the CLI, you go ng build -- prod, and it crushes it down into the smallest app possible. And part of that process is AOT, or ahead of time compilation. You take your templates, you pre-compile them on your machine, and then turn them into executable JavaScript. So different kilobytes, megabytes, like I said. This is a real pain when you've got a different build tool in a different setting building it. And if you go too many days or hours without running AOT on it and you've installed 4 other libraries and done lots of dev, then all of a sudden AOT breaks, which it does all the time. And then you're like, oh, which thing broke? So make sure my tip is just run AOT all the time if you're going down this approach. And then you just don't run into that problem. A little slower to build, but then you don't have this issue. So I've done this lots actually, like this NPM package thing works quite well. And then you can share between the two. But like I said, more recently, this whole NX Workspace stuff has come around. Who's heard of narwhal extensions? 2 people. Okay, so not many people in the room have heard of it. Who's heard of the Angular CLI again? Almost everybody. Okay, so it's easy to understand what it does. It's like, basically it's the Angular CLI extended. So it's narwhal extensions for Angular. So narwhal is a team, and they've produced this tool, and it's basically Angular CLI on steroids. So it's not anything new or crazy. It's just extra commands that scaffold extra stuff for you to allow you to have multiple projects in one Angular application. All right, it's made by these guys. They're Narwhal. Half of them are from the Angular core team. They left, made their own consulting company. This is an important thing for me because any new tools I don't trust. But these guys wrote a lot of Angular, like the dependency injection and the router and things like that. And they configure libraries all day long. That's what they do at Google. And now they have a consulting company. They do enterprise Angular. And they're like, Angular CLI is great, but we want more stuff. So they've gone and written an extension to it. And basically, this approach I'm showing you would be not using NPM packages, but using that. Okay. So here's a really rough example of what it would look like. You would have 2 applications. You could have as many as you want. They're all inside the same mono repo. So one repository, one package.json, one node modules folder. So it's a part of a deal of it, one repo. And then you have, say, a sample-web application and a sample-mobile application. And then you would have libs. So it's all about having multiple Angular apps. And then these libs are the way that you share code. So you make multiple libs and compose them together for each application, and that's how you make your apps. So your apps are really just become more like skeletons, and you just import all these libs, which are Angular modules. So you might have libs that are specific just for those apps, like sample-web libs, like layout, and then sample-mobile libs, which will just have the pieces of code that are just for that library or just for that app. But then you'll have a whole bunch of reusable ones like this, and then they can be shared across everywhere. So I really, really like this. I've done lots of Angular projects, and I've done lots of team-based ones and lots of sharing across code, and I've been using this now for a couple of months. It's very new still, but it's been great. I've got a project that is soon to be in production we've been using with it. I ran a workshop here on it recently. It's something I'm very excited about, even if I'm not doing mobile, even if I was doing one Angular application, because it's opinionated, And if you just follow it, you're going to avoid probably 90% of the mistakes you could make choosing how to scaffold a project. And on top of that, your team don't have to spend weeks deciding on best practices and researching. So big fan. All right. This is how you make it. You basically npm install the Angular CLI globally and the narwhal extensions globally, and then you just run create NX Workspace and give it a name. So it's just really an extension to the CLI. That's something to remember. And for me, it's something that I keep forgetting, and I talk with the guys who make it. My friend Justin's one of the people on the team, and he always goes, Duncan, the thing that you come to me with these problems and you forget that all it is an extension to the CLI. If I have a problem, it's not a Duncan problem or a custom problem or an NX problem. It's more a CLI problem or an Angular module problem. So really don't think of it as something too new. It's just an extension to the CLI. So it makes you this, and you can see straight away if you've seen an Angular CLI project, it's different. In Angular CLI project, you just have one app folder. Here you've got an apps folder and a libs folder. So you put multiple apps in the apps folder, and all the shared code goes in the libs folder. Not many people are doing this with Ionic yet, I'll be honest. I'm probably one of the few people to do it. I've seen people doing it with native script that's like Ionic. There's a guy called Nathan Walker. He's got some awesome Egghead.io videos worth checking out if you're going to do the native script version of this. But this is still really new. And Ionic is really not built to be used in line with Angular's build system, yeah? Ionic has its own build system to compile it for being on the App Store as an IPK or an APK. So I stick it in a separate folder called mobile apps, because I just go, what I really want to win from is not writing my code twice and having it be less buggy for that reason and be able to spend more time making better components. So I really just want to get the benefit of this in the mobile app, the Ionic app, just for those libs. So I'm happy to say, I'll cut my losses, I'm going to stick it in its own folder, and it's its own build system inside of that folder in the same repository, but all of the big benefit is the libs. So the build system, all the benefits I get out of NX, like NX will run tests across all of your apps at once and know when things have changed across your app for your build tools and stuff, but you lose that in this approach, but it's easier than the NPM packages. So inside your libs, you end up with these subdirectories again. So here I've got a sample app example, or shared for all the things I'm going to share, and a state folder in the libs folder for all the different pieces of state. Because in NgRx, you'll have slices of state, auth, lib, users, entity blah, so forth. So here with this auth one, I make it just like I'm writing Angular. This isn't the hard part of sharing code. When you share code, you're just writing Angular modules. And once you can write an Angular module, you can share it. The trick is, how do you share it? So here, I would write it down here in a lib, and NX gives me all these tools for being able to do that and exposing it out to this apps folder and the separate apps. So when I want to get it, all I do is I import my NX lib, and you can see here it's namespace this NX lib. It said import auth module from @sample/state/auth. And if we go back here, you can see the folder structure is libs/auth. But where does it get this @sample from? So this is like a namespacing that it does. Otherwise, it would be like ../../.././libs/state/auth. So here you've got this namespacing. So this is an example of how NX kind of wraps everything up and helps you have a system for doing this. So I import it here, and then when I want to use it, I just use it like any module that I've written in Angular. I just say, I just register my NX lib by saying auth module.forRoot. So it's no different than using the npm packages. The difference really is, where do you build it? Do you build it in this separate thing in an npm package and then have to version it and put it up there and bring it back down and go through this dev cycle? Or do you build it right there in the same folder, in the same app, in the same repository, and take all that out of it? All right. So I've done an interview with Justin on this on my blog, duncanhunter.com.au, if you want to learn more about it. They're also starting to pump out a lot of content on it. I think it's going to be a pretty big thing this year, NX, for the Angular world, because it's not hard to use and it's just an extension of the CLI. I think they also just did a interview, or I know they just did an interview on Angular Air as well. So you'll start to hear a lot more about this NX stuff. So why do I like it? Why would I go and quit my job, start my own project, put my own dollars, and then decide to use NX? Well, it's going to be much faster to configure a project. I don't have to go get this Yeoman generator and teach the guys who are working with me on this project how to use it. I just NX install, make me a new project, and it's ready to go. It's much faster to integrate my shared code as well. Like when I'm actually doing my development, I don't have this npm linking. Another developer doesn't have to wait to get at it. It's all in the same repository. It's all there all the time. Shared dependencies. I'm going to call this a plus and a minus. Like I said before, you're not going to have any versions. It's a mono repo. So you've just got one version of your repository, and these libs aren't versioned. So if you've got two apps and they need only one of them, and one's managed by one team and one's managed by another team, and team two is not ready to pull in your new version of your lib, well then you know that's a challenge. What do you do? Because in this approach, everyone has to update all the time. But on a flip side of that, you're only going to have one version of everything. So you won't open up your project and go, oh, we'll open up this project and then this project and then this repo, and see that you've got three versions of TypeScript, and you're like, well, they can't use the update anyway because their version of TypeScript's different, and then why have you got three projects sharing code with three versions of TypeScript and so forth? So this is a problem, but it solves the problem by enforcing that you're on one version of everything. All right. Build tool is another big lesson. We're learning this at the moment. Classically, we make a back-end project and a front-end project, and we deploy them separately. And then when we make another front-end project, we deploy that separately, and it's a separate repository for everything. So build is really easy. You just build one thing at a time. But in this case, you're going to build everything at once. So when I say monorepo, people go, oh, do I put my back-end in here as well? My current project, we're using serverless, so yes, we put all our functions in there as well, and we build that at the same time. But you don't have to, and you don't have to put all of your Angular apps in here. You could say, these two Angular apps are going to be sharing so much code, let's make one repository of them, but our other 5 Angular applications our company have, let's stick that in a different repository and not use NX. You don't have to put, it doesn't have to be a huge monorepo, it could just be a mini one. You could just have one Angular app. So the build size is also, a bit of a challenge there, but it's also a positive because when you build your Angular app, you also build your libs, and you know they're going to work together and all the tests run at once. So it's also much faster and easier to update stuff because you don't have to wonder if it's going to break the consuming application. So you can see I'm biased, yeah. I'm kind of betting on this one and really like it. But that's because I'm able to not have to have versions of these packages. But let's just say my project gets more robust in the next 6 months, and I have some things that aren't changing, and I want to make them shareable to the public because they're in this private repository. They're just Angular modules. I could suck them out, use the Angular 2 library and turn them into NPM packages and have a combination of a mono repo and some NPM installed packages. Okay. So where to from here? Where do I think we're going to be going with this sharing code stuff with Angular? Because there's one big pain point at the moment with doing Ionic and Angular is that there's components. I can't take my components that I'm writing for this web app at the moment that are all in Angular material. So it's an Angular material toolbar and an Angular material list and a material card and all these HTML elements. And I can't take them and put them in my mobile app. So I've got all these duplicated kind of features across both of them. And I'd really love to have the exact same HTML across both. So if I have a list on my mobile, I want to use the same HTML for it, same component, presentational component in the web, but the web will obviously just expand responsively to have that list wider, but same code. But you can't quite do that just yet. But Ionic are really interesting and they're betting the world on web components. So they've just yesterday released their first stencil app demo application for making PWAs or progressive web apps. And it's got you can already use all of their Ionic components as web components. There's no documentation. It's a bit clunky and difficult to figure out the exact syntax, but it's coming. It's really soon, and Ionic 4 is going to be based on this. So I think this year we'll see that a project like mine, where I'm trying to share across these two, I'll use these stencil components from Ionic that are pre-built, like I'd use with Material on my web apps as well, and then I'll actually also share all of the markup across my mobile and web, and I'll get, who knows, maybe 90% code reuse across the two. But at the moment, I don't want to mess around with it. The project's got to get done, so I'm just going to use Material on my web application and wait until Ionic get a bit closer to to something that's production ready. I'm going to be in Minnesota for the next NDC, or the next NDC, because there's one in Copenhagen. And I'm going to run a workshop pretty much on all these things. Some of the guys here came along to my workshop this week on this topic of NX and NgRx. So if you want to come along and join me, please do. And in summary, we had a look at Angular and Ionic, what's new. We looked at some code reuse options and how it's not as simple as copy and paste. You really need some sort of tool to help you with it. We looked at how NgRx is not just great for enterprise and dealing with state, but sucking that logic out. And then we looked at the two options around NPM packages and mono repos. So hopefully I've inspired you guys to go have a play with some of these tools. This is how you can get a handle on me on Twitter. I just leave my direct messages open. If you want to just direct message me, feel free. And I'm going to hang out after this off stage. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to grab me. Thanks, guys.